Well, it was another week of sound and fury in the carbon tax debate, and in the middle of it, Ross Garnaut released his final report on Australia's response to climate change, at least as he sees it. It recommends a starting price of $26 a tonne for carbon dioxide emissions, compensation for low and middle income earners through personal tax cuts, and scaling back support for affected industries. Neil Woolrich reports.
The climate change debate might be going around in circles, but now the major players are turning the rhetoric up a notch.
He's a member of a coalition that really is in dispute with the climate change science.
All of our heavy manufacturing is at grave risk of disappearing under this carbon tax.
I don't accept that my country is a pissant country.
Professor Ross Garnaut this week released his final climate change report, arguing that since 2008 the science has become gloomier, but technological progress better.
On balance, the bottom line is that the case for doing our fair share in a strong global effort is just a bit stronger than it was a few years ago.
Ross Garnaut is recommending Australia's carbon tax should start around $26 a tonne, raising $11.5 billion in its first year. That money would then be used to support low and middle income households, innovations in emissions reductions and trade-exposed industries.
The economic analysis shows that putting a price on carbon under the arrangements proposed in this final report will not reduce the total number of jobs in manufacturing, universities, farming or tourism.
We were a little disappointed, I'd say, that Professor Garnaut had a tone of dismissiveness around that issue and was suggesting that that concern was overblown.
The whole point of this is we want to significantly change the way the economy works. We want to make the economy much more efficient and sustainable in terms of emissions. So it won't be the case that there aren't losers out of that. It won't be the case that the transition is not difficult in some cases.
Professor Garnaut's arguments are yet to soothe the concerns of the peak industry groups. They want a carbon price gradually phased in from a much lower base, like $10 a tonne, and better protection for exporters.
I think the potential for collateral damage from doing this is really very real.
Boral Cement is one business which could be hit hard by a carbon price. It's a big carbon dioxide emitter and is also exposed to the high Australian dollar. The head of Boral Cement Division, Mike Beardsall, is worried that Ross Garnaut's final report is suggesting less assistance for trade-exposed firms and phasing out that assistance faster.
Now, that would be a huge concern to our cement business because the process by its nature emits a lot of CO2 and we're highly exposed to those considerations.
Modelling shows that the CPRS will destroy 126,000 jobs across all trade-exposed industries. And why is that? Because it doesn't protect trade-exposed industries. Only 16% of Australian exporters will receive assistance compared to 73% under the EU scheme.
And a sticking point that's still to be resolved is why Australia should start an emissions trading scheme in the absence of any binding international targets.
Australia is not an island economically, and whilst we all understand that a carbon trading scheme is theoretically the best way to reduce our carbon emissions, those assumptions fall down when you're operating in amongst other economies that don't have the same tax.
However, Ross Garnaut argues there is international agreement to hold temperature increases to 2 degrees and a commitment to concerted unilateral action.
It's not as certain and reliable a process as a binding agreement like I would have liked, like Australia and Europe would have liked. But it's what we've got, and I think that it can be made to work.
Professor Garnaut says there's no risk of Australia moving ahead of the rest of the world. But if his recommendation of $26 a tonne is accepted, Australia's carbon tax would be higher than the current EU price of $23 or the tax that's imposed among 10 states in the US, which is trading at just $1.90 a tonne.
The CPRS will raise more revenue in the first month than the US scheme it has in 2 years and more in its first 3 months than the EU scheme in 5 years.
The irony of this scheme is that we will have a bigger incentive to replace our cement production with imported cement from overseas than we do replacing it with blast furnace slag, even though that would be by far the better result for the environment.
For most businesses, they're maybe not encouraged to think about how to reduce their footprint. If there's no pressure on them to do that, if there's no cost issues with them not worrying about it, then they simply won't think about it.
It's now up to the government, along with the Greens and Independents, to thrash out the fine detail of Australia's carbon pricing scheme.
This is the fourth time that Australia has moved towards economy-wide carbon pricing. Each time the retreat of economy-wide action did not mean the end of climate change mitigation policies. An array of regulatory interventions took their place, with little effect on emissions but large effects on the Australian standard of living.
The Minerals Council is already frustrated by a lack of consultation, setting the stage for a new showdown between government and business.